He did his law degree from Pune, and he also got opportunity to do his LLM in American University, Washington College of Law. And today he will be speaking on United Nations and China, its role and obligation to the United Nations human rights mechanisms. And this session will be, presentation will be for half an hour and will be followed by questions and answers. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Namgyal. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, first of all, I want to welcome everyone, and I also want to thank Tibet Museum for inviting me. And first of all, I want to talk a bit about my work that I do in the UN, EU and Human Rights Desk of the Department of Information and International Relations at CTA based in Dharamsala. Basically, our work is to monitor and research on the human rights situations inside Tibet, and more importantly, to report it to the UN Human Rights Council sessions and EU-related agencies, and to government foreign ministries through our offices of Tibet. Now, Tibet Museum asked me to speak on the United Nations and any topic that I wanted to speak on. So I chose this topic because China, being a major player in global world affairs these days, and more importantly, China has been for this year, China is not a member of UN Human Rights Council. And also in October, the UPR session that I'll talk more later is coming up for review with regard to China's human rights record. So I thought it's important not only for Tibetans, but also for the everyone to look at China's record and how do they approach the UN, specifically with regard to the UN human rights mechanisms. First of all, I guess many of you know the UN, United Nations. After the failure of the League of Nations to prevent the violence and the Second World War, the world order has changed after the Second World War. So many new countries emerged, and many of the major players came together in San Francisco and formulated the Charter of the United Nations, which was signed. And this is a foundational treaty, foundational charter, and formed the international organization that we know as the United Nations in 1945. At that time, 50 of the nations plus one, that is Poland, which was not present in the meeting, so Poland entered a few months later. So 51 of them got together and signed this treaty and created the United Nations. As of today, we have 193 independent states in the United Nations. And since there was this lack of credibility, lack of efficiency with the League of Nations and the World War II, the main aim of the United Nations was to maintain peace and international security and respect the human rights. Now, one important thing is the United Nations, to maintain peace and international security, is mostly dealt by the UN General Assembly and more so by the UN Security Council. And but with regard to the respect and promotion of human rights, the need for another mechanism or system was felt, and so the Commission on Human Rights was set up right after that in 1946. And so this is actually the key moments in the history of international human rights law, how it emerged. Then we have this Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. Then we have General Assembly Resolution 1540, which is important in the sense that it was a declaration for the forming of independent nations from the colonial era, out of the colonial period. And then we have this another treaty, International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination in 1965. And then we have International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and another important one is International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. So I won't go into deep because it's very technical in a sense, and we will touch more on the Chinese version, how they perceive it. And then we also have the General Assembly Resolution 2625, because it is important because the declaration forms the ground principle with regard to the self-determination of a distinct people. So that's, I thought, is important in the form of history of international human rights system. If you have any questions in between, if it's not clear, just raise and stop me. I want to make this in an interactive session. And now, with regard to the human rights system, the most important international, we call it International Bill of Rights. It's basically the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Now, Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a declaration which has no binding obligations on the states. So, the creation of international civil and political rights and international covenant on economic, social, and cultural rights was felt, and from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 2 treaties were created. Now I'll talk more with regard to the treaty-based mechanism. These are treaties. That means those states who sign and ratify has only the obligations to follow these treaties. As in the human rights system, we have 2 main bodies in the sense charter-based mechanisms and treaty-based mechanisms. Charter-based mechanisms is mostly formed from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, whereas treaty-based mechanisms are all those treaties as in ICCPR, ICESCR, and the elimination of racial discrimination. These are all treaties which are cannot be enforceable unless the state parties ratifies it. And then we have regional mechanisms. Unfortunately, Asia doesn't have a sound regional mechanism, whereas Americas, Europe, and even Africa has a good, it's developing in the Africa. We have America's Commission on Human Rights and European Commission on Human Rights. We even have very functional European Court of Human Rights. Now, just to give you a brief overview of the UN Human Rights Council. Now, as I talked about UN Commission on Human Rights, it was set up in 1946, but there were so many instances where the gross violators of human rights became the member state of the UN Commission on Human Rights, and more so sometimes became the president of the UN Commission on Human Rights. So there was the unanimous majority of the General Assembly felt the need to change the UN Commission on Human Rights and set up a new body which is called the UN Human Rights Council. And it was established in March 2006 by the General Assembly to replace the UN Commission on Human Rights. And it has presently 47 member states. And earlier, gross violators cannot be removed from the UN Commission on Human Rights, but now gross violators can be removed by 2/3 majority of General Assembly. And its main aim is to promote, coordinate, monitor, and mainstream human rights internationally and within the UN system. Now, for an average human being, average citizen around the world, if they have any grievances against the state policy or any related to human rights abuses, the first approach towards the UN basically is towards the UN Human Rights Council. So, under the UN Human Rights Council, we have special procedures, which is very important, and another mechanism which evolved recently is universal periodic review that I'll talk a bit later. Now, under the special procedures, now we have 2 bodies, in the sense one is country mandates and the thematic mandates. Now, country mandates are basically you appoint an independent expert based on the situation within a country. For example, you appoint a special rapporteur on the case of Sudan or Sri Lanka. It depends. Whereas thematic mandates is based on the theme around the world. For example, we have 8 on civil and political rights. For example, we have a special rapporteur on torture, special rapporteur on summary executions, likewise freedom of expression, and also we have 8 on economic, social, and cultural rights. Again, it has been divided within the civil and political rights and economic and social and cultural rights. And we have 9 on specific groups. And also we have another working group, independent experts working on specific area of concern, like arbitrary detention, enforced and involuntary disappearances, mercenaries, and African descent. Now, next is what's the role of the special procedures. For example, if there's a special rapporteur on torture, what's his role? He accepts urgent appeals from individual, from group of people, or any NGOs. Then, if possible, he makes country visits. Now, it is sometimes people accuses UN of its failure to implement its mechanisms, but it's also on the part of the member states to receive the visits, because and at the end of the day, it is if, for example, Special Rapporteur on Torture wanted to visit China, if China doesn't welcome it or invite the rapporteur, he cannot do so. So, if it all goes well, then the follow-up on the actions taken by the state takes place. Then normative work, which is not really technically in terms of legal sense, but norms that have been created in the past, and to follow up or work in the normative divisions and produce annual reports and submit it to the Human Rights Council. So these are the key responsibilities of the special procedure. Now the next is universal periodic review. This is something of interest to many NGOs and citizens, human rights defenders, because this is a periodic review. It was started in 2006 after the creation of Human Rights Council, and it is as it's written, a fulfillment of human rights obligation and commitment based on an interactive dialogue. Now this is, when you do a review, sometimes, for example, special procedures, they have this special rapporteur asking for information. Now special rapporteur is an independent expert, personal or a working group which is independent body, but here you are being reviewed by your peers, your counterparts. So example, China was reviewed in 2006. In 2009. At that time, first, China has to file a report saying that what China has done to improve the human rights situation. At that time, they came out with a National Human Rights Plan of Action in 2009 and 10. And then the other countries, all the 193 member states, can question China and held accountable to any of the human rights issues that are within the China. And Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights, other relevant stakeholders like NGOs, national human rights institutions. For example, NGOs here is the NGOs, there's a criteria for the NGOs to submit its questionnaires or reports. The NGOs are only within the scope of ECOSOC consultative status. There's the NGOs which has to be the member of ECOSOC consultative, having the consultative status. Now, China's review is due in October 2013 this year. So now we will look back into the pledges or commitment made by China in 2009 and whether they have implemented those pledges or promises. Now the member states of not only the Human Rights Council but whole of UN General Assembly has the opportunity to ask China what they have done in the past, whether it has improved or worsened, the situation has worsened. For example, in case of Tibet, 2009, now 2013, the situations inside Tibet has worsened manifold. Now China's role and obligation in the UN system. Interestingly, China was one of the founding members of the United Nations, but at that time it was technically represented by the Chiang Kai-shek's Republic of China and the present-day Taiwan. And till 1971, the Republic of China, the Taiwan, has taken the seat of the China, represented the China. But in 1971, UN General Assembly passed a resolution recognizing the People's PRC as the rightful representative of China in the UN, and also got the permanent seat on the UN Security Council. And the Republic of China was expelled from the UN altogether. Interestingly, the UN Commission on Human Rights, which was the drafting committee of the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, Peng Chung-chang, I don't know whether I pronounced it correctly, he was a representative from China at that time, and he was one of the founding member or vice chairman of that drafting committee of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Now, China's active engagement within the UN. Beginning in 1971, when People's Republic of China was first brought into the UN system, the UN General Assembly, they declared all those multilateral treaties as illegal, void, and null. And this was a big setback for the global community, because at that time China has ratified the ICCPR and Covenant on Social, Economic and Cultural Rights. And again, China has always been pursuing a global reform agenda targeting West to involve more developing countries in the UN system. And they finally joined the UN Commission on Human Rights in 1982 and sent large delegation. At that time, China was wary of what's going on, whether to just jump into the human rights system or to stay back. So they have been sending huge delegation in the beginning years just as an observant. And finally in 1982 they joined the UN Commission on Human Rights. Now the role of China is in early 80s, it abstained on most of the resolutions of the UN. Rather than being a proactive member, it just stayed back and watched carefully. And then sometimes in 1980s they also supported country resolutions on Afghanistan and Cambodia and condemned Russia on their for aggression on these states. But at this time, since it was not systematic in their approach, it was very it's not consistent enough to make having a specific foreign policy as such. But one thing is consistent is they always oppose interference in other countries, so they normally claim that under the pretext of human rights, don't interfere in other states' interest. Now, at that time, but still they were quite welcoming and quite receptive of the whole human rights system. But in 1989, during the Tiananmen Square killings, the United Nations and many other countries placed the arms embargo, sanctions, and passed so many resolutions. And even in 90s, with regard to Tibet, I'll touch Tibet later on. And at that time, they felt the heat of the UN human rights system. And from there on, and also the fact that from the 1990s, there was an economic reform in China, and there was huge development that has been going on in China. And then China has been started asserting itself as a global power, and at the same time cracking down on dissidents or opponents. So, but China has been that their image at the global stage is not that good in terms of human rights. So their approach to the UN human rights system has always been very participants after the late 80s or 90s. They have been coming with huge delegation in Human Rights Council, summits and listens to arguments. Unlike sometimes Israel, sometimes they just back off. But then China has been very proactive in late 90s because they knew what's going to happen after, because they had sanctions, arms embargo after during the Tiananmen Square killings. Now China's discourse in Human Rights Council have been deferred in the sense that they sometimes don't accept the universality of the human rights. Now their position has been changed a bit after the Universal Periodic